For centuries, the only thing standing between a person and a deadly disease was something small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. A handful of flowers, a little scented ball tucked into a pocket. That was it. That was the entire defense. So why, at some point, did a doctor decide the answer was a 6-inch beak shaped like a bird's? The real story behind that mask is far stranger, and far more logical than most people ever guess. Before we get to the beak, we need to clear up a misconception that trips up almost everyone. Picture a plague doctor in your head right now. Chances are you just imagined him looming over victims of the Black Death in the 1300s. That image is wrong. Completely wrong. The Black Death tore through Europe between 1347 and 1350, killing roughly a third of the entire population, and at that moment in history, the beaked mask did not exist. Not even close. It wouldn't appear for another 300 years, surfacing in the 1600s during a fresh wave of plague outbreaks that swept across France and Italy. That single fact catches almost everyone off guard. So what were people doing before the beak? They weren't defenseless. The most common tool was the nosegay, a small handheld bouquet of fresh or dried flowers held right up against the face. The logic was simple. If the smell was pleasant, maybe the sickness couldn't get through. Alongside it was the pomander, a decorative little ball or container stuffed with herbs, spices, and other fragrant material. Some were as humble as an orange jabbed full of cloves. Others were lavish, hand-carved treasures that wealthy families displayed in their homes, or carried like jewelry. Even the walking canes physicians used sometimes hid a secret compartment built just to hold a pomander inside the handle. These were the everyday tools of disease prevention. Cheap, portable, and already trusted by ordinary people long before any doctor strapped a mask to his face. So if these small devices already existed and people already believed in them, why did one doctor decide he needed something far more extreme? It comes down to a single man, Charles de Lorme, physician to King Louis XIII of France. In 1619, de Lorme designed what would go on to become the single most recognizable medical costume in history. He didn't invent the idea of using scent as a weapon against disease. He simply took it, scaled it up, and turned it into something a doctor could wear on his face for hours without ever setting it down. His entire design rested on a theory called miasma. Remember, nobody in the 1600s understood that bacteria caused illness. Physicians were convinced disease traveled through foul, rotting air released by corpses, swamps, and decaying matter. If bad air was the enemy, then the obvious defense was to filter every single breath before it ever reached the lungs. And a pomander you sniffed once in a while just wasn't enough anymore, not for a man spending hour after hour hovering over the dying. This is exactly where the beak comes in. And it wasn't some random design choice, it solved 3 real problems that ordinary pomanders and nosegays simply couldn't touch. Problem 1, doctors needed their hands completely free. Examining a plague patient meant checking a pulse, probing swollen lymph nodes, sometimes performing crude procedures right there on the spot. A doctor gripping a pomander in one fist couldn't do any of that properly. By building the herbs directly into a mask strapped over the face, de Lorme freed up both hands at once. Problem 2, protection needed to be constant, not occasional. A nosegay only worked the moment someone actually lifted it up and breathed it in. The beak, on the other hand, filtered every single breath automatically, for as long as it stayed on the doctor's face. 2 small holes near the nostrils let air in, but only after it had already been forced through a dense packing of herbs. Problem 3 is the cleverest part of the entire design, and it's the one detail de Lorme actually wrote about himself. He believed the length of the beak mattered enormously. In his own words, he described the mask as having a nose half a foot long, shaped like a beak, and filled with perfume, with only 2 small holes near the nostrils. His reasoning was almost mathematical. The longer the distance air had to travel through the packed herbs, the more thoroughly it would be purified before it ever touched him. A stubby little mask simply couldn't offer that kind of distance. The exaggerated beak wasn't there for drama. In de Lorme's mind, it was pure functional engineering. And that beak wasn't just crammed with whatever was lying around. Doctors packed it with dried roses, carnations, lavender, and peppermint. Many relied on something called theriac, an ancient, centuries-old cure-all made from more than 50 separate ingredients, including cinnamon, myrrh, honey, and, remarkably, powdered viper flesh. Others turned to camphor, cloves, or a sponge soaked in vinegar. A rare few even used ambergris, an extraordinarily expensive substance produced inside the digestive tracts of sperm whales. Whatever the specific recipe, The goal never changed: flood the air with something powerful enough to smother the stench of death, and in theory, smother the disease that was believed to travel inside it. The mask was never the whole outfit either. Doctors wore a long coat treated with wax, thick leather gloves, tall boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that covered nearly every inch of exposed skin. Glass lenses shielded the eyes from the same poisoned air the beak was supposedly filtering out. Many also carried a long wooden cane, which served three purposes at once: examining patients from a safe distance, lifting clothing to check for swollen buboes, and holding back terrified, desperate crowds who pressed in too close. Now here's where the story takes a sharp, uncomfortable turn. None of it actually worked, not for the reason anyone at the time believed anyway. The plague was never caused by foul-smelling air. It was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, spread primarily through the bite of infected fleas, and in some cases through infected respiratory droplets passed between people. The herbs stuffed inside that beak did absolutely nothing to stop bacteria. The entire theory the costume was engineered around turned out to be flatly, completely wrong. But there's a strange twist buried inside the failure. While the herbs themselves were useless, the rest of the outfit may have offered some genuine accidental protection. That thick, waxed leather coat created an actual physical barrier between doctor and patient. Historians now suspect this layer may have reduced direct contact with fleas and contaminated fluids, the real vectors of the disease. So, in a strange way, these doctors weren't protected by their science at all. They were protected, at least in part, by pure luck. There's one more layer to this story that has nothing to do with medicine, and it's the part people almost always miss. The mask served a social function too. A plague doctor wearing that beak was instantly recognizable from across a town square. Everyone knew exactly what that silhouette meant the moment they saw it. Stay back. Danger is here. These doctors were often hired specifically to treat plague victims and were expected to isolate themselves from everyone else. Wearing the mask was, in its own strange way, an act of publicly accepting that isolation. No hidden pomander or discreet sponge could ever send a warning that loud or that clear. It's also worth pointing out that this costume wasn't some universal European phenomenon. Historical records place its actual use almost entirely within France and Italy during the 1600s and early 1700s. There's little solid evidence it was ever common practice in German-speaking regions, or really anywhere else on the continent. The image so many people now associate with the entire plague era was, in reality, a fairly narrow and localized practice. So why did a handful of doctors trade something simple and normal for a 6-inch bird-shaped beak strapped to their faces? Because a small bouquet or a scented ball couldn't free their hands, couldn't offer constant protection, and couldn't give the air enough distance to travel through the herbs meant to purify it. According to the science of the time, at least, the beak was a genuine attempt to solve a real problem built entirely on the wrong information. It was flawed, occasionally accidentally useful, and somehow it became one of the most enduring images in the entire history of medicine. What began as a desperate attempt to survive an invisible killer eventually turned into a costume people wear to carnivals and Halloween parties centuries later. So the next time that haunting, bird-like silhouette crosses your screen, you'll know it was never just for show. It was built, piece by piece, around a theory that turned out to be dead wrong.